It was Christmas Eve when Alejandro Mendoza, 35, the CEO of a tech empire worth €700 million, sat on a snow-covered park bench in Madrid, tears streaming down his face. He had just received the call that shattered his heart. His mother, the only person he had left in the world, had passed away 3 hours earlier in a hospital in Seville while he was stuck in a meeting he couldn't interrupt. He hadn't made it in time to say goodbye, and now he was alone, completely alone. In a city that was celebrating while he fell apart. That's when he heard a small voice speaking to him. A 5-year-old boy in a red coat and a beige wool hat was looking at him with those big, innocent eyes that only children have. And the words that came out of his mouth changed everything. With the disarming simplicity of a 5-year-old, the boy said something no adult would ever dare to say. Standing behind him, wrapped in a light blue coat, his mother was approaching. Unaware that this night she would meet the man who would change her life. If you're ready for this story, comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Christmas in Madrid is breathtaking. The lights along Gran Via sparkle like a river of fallen stars. Puerta del Sol glows with its giant tree, and the Christmas markets in Plaza Mayor fill the air with the scent of roasted chestnuts and hot chocolate. Snow, rare and precious, had started falling at dusk on December 24th, turning the city into a scene from an old postcard. Alejandro Mendoza saw none of it. Sitting on a bench in Retiro Park, near the Crystal Palace lit up for the holidays, all he could see was the emptiness that had opened inside him, a void so deep it seemed to swallow every light, every sound, every hope. At 35, with dark hair and an athletic build maintained by 5 a.m. gym sessions before meetings, he was the kind of man who graced the covers of business magazines. Journalists called him Spain's tech genius, the one who had turned a garage startup into a €700 million giant in under 10 years. He owned homes on 3 continents, a watch collection worth as much as an apartment, and a schedule so packed that his assistant had to book lunch breaks 3 weeks in advance. But that night, Alejandro Mendoza wasn't a CEO. He was just a man who had lost his mother. The call had come at 5:30 p.m. He was in the middle of a critical meeting that would decide the acquisition of a Barcelona startup. His phone vibrated in his pocket, but he ignored it, as he always did during important meetings. It vibrated again. And again. On the 4th call, he finally answered, irritated and ready to scold whoever had dared interrupt. It was the hospital in Seville. His mother, Carmen Mendoza, 72, had been admitted that morning after suddenly feeling unwell. She had asked for him. Kept asking for him for hours. But he hadn't been reachable. His phone was on silent. His assistant had strict orders not to forward personal calls during strategic meetings. Carmen Mendoza died at 2:26 p.m., alone in a hospital room, calling for a son who never came. Alejandro left the meeting without a word. He walked out of the building and wandered aimlessly for hours until he ended up on that bench. And there, for the first time since he was 12, he cried. He cried for his mother, for all the birthdays he'd missed, all the calls he'd put off, all the Sunday paella dinners he'd cancelled at the last minute. He cried for the man he had become, rich, powerful, and utterly alone. His mother had been all he had left. His father died when he was 8. He had no siblings, and romantic relationships had always been sacrificed for work. There had been one woman, Valentina, 5 years earlier. A wonderful woman who loved him deeply. But he had chosen a major acquisition over the vacation she had planned for months. Valentina left, and he hadn't stopped her because there was always something more urgent, more important. Now there was nothing left. Nothing and no one. Just a cold bench, falling snow, and tears he couldn't stop. That's when he noticed him, a small boy, no more than 5, in a bright red coat, jeans, and a beige wool hat covering his ears. He was holding a golden gift bag and staring at Alejandro with the intense curiosity only children have. Alejandro quickly wiped his tears, embarrassed to be caught in such a vulnerable moment. But the boy didn't judge. He just tilted his head slightly, as if trying to figure out something very important. The boy's name was Mateo. He was 5.5. And that half was very important to him. Blonde hair peeked out from under his hat, his big blue eyes like the sky, and he had that raw honesty adults lose too soon. He walked straight up to the bench like he was on a mission, stopped in front of Alejandro, and studied him for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his words cut through every defense Alejandro had built over a lifetime. He asked why Alejandro was crying. Not out of nosy curiosity, but with genuine concern, as if a stranger's pain was something that deserved attention, something to understand and, if possible, ease. Alejandro didn't know how to answer. He wasn't used to talking about his feelings, especially not to a child. But there was something in those little eyes, a purity that wouldn't accept lies, that pushed him to tell the truth. He said he was sad because he had lost his mom. Mateo nodded seriously, as if he fully understood the weight of those words. He thought for a moment, his face scrunched in that solemn expression children get when pondering big things. Then he said the words Alejandro would never forget. He told him not to cry. He said Alejandro could borrow his mom if he wanted. His mom gave the best hugs when you were sad, he explained. And she made the world's best hot chocolate. Alejandro felt something melt inside his chest. It was an absurd, impossible, wonderfully simple offer. A 5-year-old willing to share the most precious thing he had, his mother, with a stranger crying on a bench. Before Alejandro could respond, a woman's voice called the boy's name. A woman hurried over, her face worried. She wore a light blue coat over a gold dress, her blonde hair framing a kind face, and she carried shopping bags that hinted at a day spent preparing for Christmas. Clara Navarro, 34, was a woman life hadn't spared. Widowed 3 years earlier when her husband Miguel died in a car accident, she had raised Mateo alone, working as an elementary school teacher and stretching every penny to make ends meet. She had no family in Madrid. Her parents lived in Malaga, and she couldn't afford to visit often. But despite everything, she had raised an incredible son, a boy who saw others' pain and wanted to heal it. She approached the bench, a mix of worry and embarrassment on her face. She gently scolded Mateo for wandering off, then apologized to Alejandro for the trouble. But he stopped her. He told her what her son had said, and something shifted in her eyes, embarrassment, tenderness, and perhaps recognition of a pain she knew all too well. She sat down on the bench beside him, Mateo between them. For the first time in years, Alejandro found himself talking to someone who wanted nothing from him, no contracts, no investments, no favors. Just human conversation. On Christmas Eve, as snow continued to fall, they talked. Mateo, with the limited stamina of a 5-year-old, eventually fell asleep between them, his head resting on his mother's arm, his little hand still clutching the gift bag. His breathing was steady and peaceful, unaware of the extraordinary moment unfolding above him. Alejandro talked about his mother, not the clinical facts or the circumstances of her death, but the memories. How Carmen made the best paella every Sunday. How she waited at the door when he came home from school with a snack already prepared. How she read him stories even when he was too old for them. How she supported him when everyone said his startup idea was crazy. How she believed in him when no one else did, how she remortgaged her house to give him startup money, never asking for anything in return even after he became a millionaire. He talked about the later years, and this was harder. How success had pulled him away, how calls became shorter and rarer, how Sunday paella became just a memory. How for his mother's last birthday 3 months earlier, he had been in Singapore for a conference and sent an expensive bouquet instead of being there. How she said it was fine, that she understood, that she was proud of him. And how he had always thought there would be time to make it up, to be the son she deserved. Clara listened without interrupting, her eyes filled with compassion that didn't judge. When he finished, she shared her own story. About Miguel, how they fell in love in high school on a school trip to Granada, how he wrote her terrible poems she still kept in a box under her bed, how they married young, too young, according to both sets of parents, but so in love they couldn't wait. How he was a wonderful father in the 2 years he had with Mateo, making up stories every night because book ones were never adventurous enough, doing all the character voices until Matteo laughed so hard he couldn't fall asleep. She told him about the accident, one rainy November night, a truck that lost control on a wet road. How the police came to her door at 3 a.m. How she collapsed to her knees before they even spoke. How her life ended that moment and she had to start over, one step at a time, one day at a time, for Matteo, who needed her. Two strangers on a bench, bound by grief and loss, but also by hope. That stubborn hope that never fully dies, the kind that gets you out of bed each morning even when you want to give up. The hope that lives in a sleeping child's eyes, in the scent of fresh snow, in Christmas lights that shine anyway. Alejandro looked at the sleeping boy and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not attraction to the mother, not yet. Something simpler and deeper, the desire to protect, to be present, to be part of something bigger than his business empire. He looked at that child and saw everything he could have had if he'd made different choices, everything his mother would have wanted for him. Clara looked at him and saw past the CEO facade. She saw a lonely, wounded man who had lost his way in the maze of success. Someone who needed saving as much as she needed someone to save. For reasons she couldn't explain, she wanted to help him. Maybe they could help each other. The snow had stopped. The lights of the Crystal Palace glowed in the darkness like silent guardians, and faint carols drifted on the wind from the city center. It was Christmas Eve, the night of miracles, according to tradition. And three people sat on a cold bench in a Madrid park, connected by an invisible thread none of them had expected but none wanted to break. Matteo woke first, stretching and looking around with that adorable confusion of freshly woken children. He saw the sad man was still there and smiled. Then, with the relentless logic of a 5-year-old, he asked if Alejandro wanted to come to their house for Christmas dinner. Because Mom always made too much food, and he couldn't eat it all, and it would be a shame to throw it away. Clara opened her mouth to apologize, to say they couldn't impose on a stranger, the reasonable thing an adult would do. But Alejandro spoke first. He asked if the invitation was real, his voice betraying how much he hoped it was. When Matteo nodded enthusiastically, with all the seriousness a 5-year-old could muster, Alejandro accepted. Clara's apartment was small. 2 bedrooms in the Lavapiés neighborhood, simple but cared for decor, walls covered in Matteo's drawings and photos of happier times. Nothing luxurious, nothing remotely like the life Alejandro was used to. Yet the moment he stepped inside, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, warmth. Not from the heater, but from a real home, lived in by people who loved each other. Matteo grabbed his hand and dragged him around the apartment, showing off his treasures. The Lego castle he'd built with Mom, the goldfish named Captain, the collection of toy cars his dad had given him when he was little. Alejandro listened with an attention he didn't even give his best clients, genuinely fascinated by every detail of this extraordinary child's life. Clara started cooking, improvising dinner for 3 when she had planned for 2. The kitchen filled with the smell of roasted lamb and potatoes, that simple comfort no Michelin-starred restaurant could match. She turned on the radio to a station playing Christmas carols, and the music filled the apartment with quiet joy. Alejandro offered to help, and Clara accepted, surprised. The powerful men she had met through work never offered to chop vegetables or set the table. But he did, with a clumsiness that showed how unpracticed he was, but with genuine willingness to be useful. As they cooked side by side, they talked, not about their losses this time, but about their lives. Clara shared about her job as a teacher, the kids she loved, the small daily victories of watching a student finally understand a tough concept. Alejandro talked about his company, not the profits or acquisitions, but the people who worked there, the projects that excited him, the vision that had driven him to start it all. For the first time in years, Alejandro felt seen for who he was, not what he owned. Clara had no idea about his wealth. She had never heard his name. She didn't treat him with the fake deference he got everywhere else. She treated him like a man, just a man. And that normalcy was the greatest gift he'd received in a long time. Dinner was simple and perfect. Sitting around a too small table with mismatched plates, they ate, laughed, and told stories. Mateo dominated the conversation with unstoppable enthusiasm about school, friends, dreams. He wanted to be an astronaut, or maybe a firefighter, or maybe an ice cream man so he could eat all the ice cream he wanted. After dinner, Mateo insisted on showing Alejandro his favorite books. They sat on the couch, the boy curled up between the two adults, while Clara read a Christmas story, doing different voices for each character. Alejandro listened, but his eyes often drifted to her, the way the lamp light lit her face, the smile that appeared every time Mateo laughed. When the boy finally fell asleep, this time in his own bed after goodnight kisses, Alejandro and Clara were alone in the small living room. The silence wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, filled with everything they had shared in just a few hours. Alejandro knew he should leave. He had an empty apartment waiting, a life to resume, a funeral to arrange. But he didn't want to move from that couch, from that home that smelled of food and love, from that woman who looked at him with eyes that asked for nothing. Alejandro left that night, but not before exchanging phone numbers with Clara. It was a weak excuse, the promise to return the hospitality, but they both knew there was more. The days that followed were the hardest of Alejandro's life. He arranged his mother's funeral, accepted condolences from colleagues who barely knew her name, and emptied the house he grew up in. Every object was a memory, every room a punch to the heart. But through all that pain, there was a thin thread keeping him anchored, Clara's messages. She texted every day, not intrusive, not pushing, just kind thoughts, updates about Mateo, little things that showed she was thinking of him. A drawing Mateo made of a man on a snowy bench. A photo of Captain the Goldfish, who, according to Mateo, was asking about the sad man. Alejandro always replied, even when grief made everything else nearly impossible. Those conversations became the most important part of his days, more than meetings, more than contracts, more than anything that used to seem essential. A week after Christmas, he asked to see her again. Not Mateo yet, just her. He needed to talk to someone who understood. For reasons he couldn't rationally explain, he knew she was that person. They met at a cafe in the city center, far from the areas his colleagues frequented. She arrived 10 minutes late, cheeks flushed from the cold, apologizing for traffic. He had never waited for anyone so patiently in his life. They talked for hours. About grief and how to carry it, about life moving forward even when you wish it would stop, about Mateo and how extraordinary he was, about Miguel and Carmen and everyone they had loved and lost. But they also talked about lighter things, movies, books, dreams, the small joys that make life worth living. When they left the cafe, the sun was setting and the city lights were coming on. Alejandro walked her home slowly, as if to stretch the moment. At her building's entrance, he hesitated. He wanted to kiss her but wasn't sure if it was the right time, if she wanted it, if it was too soon. Clara took the first step. She stood on her tiptoes and kissed his cheek, a simple gesture full of promise. She told him she was glad they had met, even under such terrible circumstances. And he understood that what was growing between them was real, important, worth fighting for. The weeks that followed were a slow, respectful courtship. Alejandro learned to slow down, to be present, to prioritize people over business. He started seeing Mateo regularly, taking him to the park, out for ice cream even in winter. The boy adored him with the boundless love only children can give. And Clara slowly opened up, began to trust again, allowed herself to hope, to believe that love could come twice in a lifetime. 1 year after that Christmas Eve, Alejandro Mendoza was a different man. He had stepped back from day-to-day operations at his company, delegating more to his team. He sold 2 of his 3 homes, keeping only the Madrid apartment, now shared with Clara and Mateo. He stopped working 16-hour days and discovered the world didn't end if he left the office at 6 p.m. But most of all, he had a family. He hadn't married Clara, not yet. They wanted to take things slowly, honoring what they had both lost. But they had been living together for 6 months. Every morning, Alejandro woke up grateful for a life he hadn't even known he wanted. Mateo called him Daddy Alejandro, not Dad, because that belonged forever to Miguel, but Daddy Alejandro, like it was his own special title. Every time he heard it, Alejandro's heart swelled with a joy no multimillion-dollar deal had ever given him. He had placed a photo of his mother Carmen next to one of Miguel in the living room. Mateo knew both stories. He knew Grandma Carmen was in heaven with his dad, and they had probably become friends. When they said bedtime prayers, they always included both names. On the next Christmas Eve, they returned to Retiro Park. It was Mateo's idea. He was now 6.5, with a remarkable memory. He wanted to go back to the place where he had found Alejandro, where it all began. They sat on the same bench, now covered in fresh snow. Mateo in the middle, just like that first night. Clara on one side, Alejandro on the other. They watched the lights of the Crystal Palace. Listened to carols drifting from the city center. Felt the cold bite their cheeks. Alejandro thought about how much his life had changed in just 1 year. 12 months ago, he had sat here alone, broken, convinced he would never feel joy again. Now he had everything that truly mattered: love, family, belonging. Mateo interrupted his thoughts with a question. He asked if Alejandro was still sad about his mom. Alejandro thought for a moment before answering. Yes, he said. Sometimes he was still sad, and probably always would be a little. But the sadness was different now. It was mixed with gratitude for having had her, with happy memories that made him smile, with the knowledge that she would have wanted him to be happy. Mateo nodded solemnly, as if he understood perfectly. Then he said something that brought tears to both Alejandro's and Clara's eyes. He said he was glad he had lent his mom to the sad man. Because now the man wasn't sad anymore, and he had an extra dad, and everyone was happy. And that was the best Christmas gift he could imagine. Clara wiped her eyes and squeezed Alejandro's hand over Mateo's head. He squeezed back, looking at her with all the love he had learned to feel, all the love he had denied himself for years. Snow began to fall again, light as a blessing. And on that bench, in the same positions as 1 year earlier, 3 people destiny had brought together held each other tight, knowing that whatever the future held, they would face it together. Because sometimes family isn't the one you're born into. Sometimes it's the one you find, the one you choose, the one you build piece by piece with patience and love. Sometimes it takes a 5-year-old in a red coat to remind us that the solution to the biggest problems is often the simplest. Don't cry, sir. You can borrow my mom. 7 words that changed 3 lives forever. If this story made you believe that love can arrive when you least expect it, leave a little heart below to let me know. And if you stayed until the end, it means stories like this touch something true in you too. For anyone who wants to support these stories, there's an option to leave a super thanks below. Every gesture counts. Just like those 7 words from a child meant more than 700 million. Because you chose to stay until the very last word, and that makes you as special as the people in this story.